Chapter 13. The Scourging at Tabriz. The Bab was subjected to a closer and more rigorous confinement at Shirik. The Prime Minister gave strict and explicit orders to the warden, Yahya Khan, who was the king's brother-in-law. He told Yahya Khan that no one was to be allowed to enter the Bab's presence. There were to be no exceptions to this rule. The Prime Minister specifically warned him not to follow the example of Ali Khan, who had gradually been led to disregard the orders he had received. Yet, in spite of the emphatic nature of the order, Yahya Khan found himself powerless to obey it. He, too, soon became fascinated with his prisoner and completely forgot the duty he was expected to perform. Love for the Bab claimed his entire being, and he would have preferred to be slain rather than to cause him the slightest discomfort. The villagers who lived in Shirik were initially even more hostile towards the Bab and his followers than the people of Marku had been, yet even they fell under the transforming influence of the Bab. The spirit that he radiated was a life-creating thing. It changed hate into love, enemies into friends. This is confirmed by the historian Lord Curzon in the following extract from Persia and the Persian Question. His qualities were so rare in their nobility and beauty, his personality so gentle and yet so forceful, and his natural charm was combined with so much tact and judgment, that after his declaration he quickly became in Persia a widely popular figure. He would win over almost all with whom he was brought into contact, often converting his jailers to his faith and turning the ill-disposed into admiring friends. The size of the crowds who had visited him at Marku was now dwarfed by the number of those who flocked to him at Shirik. Yahya Khan would not refuse admittance to anyone who wished to see him. So many sought his presence that there was no room to accommodate them all. They had to be housed an hour's distance away. Monsieur Mohenan, who was on duty for a foreign organization in that region, writes in his memoirs, "The multitude of hearers was so great that the court was not large enough to hold them all. Most of them stayed in the streets and listened with religious rapture. Whatever provisions were required for the Bab were purchased in Old Shirik and brought to the prison. One day some honey was purchased for him. The price seemed exorbitant. He refused it and said, 'Honey of a superior quality could no doubt have been purchased at a lower price. It behoves you in all your transactions to follow in my way. You must neither defraud your neighbor nor allow him to defraud you.' He insisted that the purchase be returned and replaced with a honey better in quality and cheaper in price. During those days a dervish walked all the way from India to seek the Bab. As soon as he met him, he embraced his faith. He told the following story. In the days when I occupied the exalted position of a Nawab in India, the Bab appeared to me in a vision. He gazed at me and won my heart completely. I arose and had started to follow him when he looked at me intently and said, 'Divest yourself of your gorgeous attire, depart from your native land, and hasten on foot to meet me in Azerbaijan. In Shirik you will attain your heart's desire.' I followed his directions and have now reached my goal." This fulfilled the words of the Islamic tradition that prophesies, "On the last day the men of the unseen shall, on the wings of the Spirit, traverse the immensity of the earth, shall attain the presence of the promised Qayyim, and shall seek from him the secret that will resolve their problems and remove their perplexities." This was but one of many remarkable events that followed upon each other in swift succession. They caused a turmoil in Shirik to eclipse that of Marku. A continuous stream of seekers and followers flowed back and forth through the old fortress. Men of distinguished merit Eminent members of the clergy and even government officials were openly and rapidly embracing the faith of the Bab. One of the most outstanding literary figures of Persia, who was also a high government official, accepted the Bab's message and devoted both his person and his pen to spreading his teachings. He was surnamed Dayan, meaning one who rewards, or judge, by the Bab. Previously, Dayan had vehemently denounced the Bab and his message. Then, one night, he had a dream which he thought he would use to test the Bab. He wrote to the Bab, saying, "I have conceived 3 definite things in my mind. I request you to reveal to me their nature." A few days later, he received a reply penned by the Bab that described the dream and revealed exactly what Dayan had had in mind. The accuracy of that reply brought about his complete conversion. Though Dayan was not accustomed to walking, he went on foot up the steep and stony path to meet the Bab. This meeting stirred in him a fiery spiritual ardour that lasted to the end of his life. The Bab knew that the hour of his deeper affliction was approaching. He told all of his followers who had gathered in Shirik to disperse and return home to their most important work, which was teaching the Bab's message to others. He instructed the believer from India to return to his native land and work unceasingly for the spread of the faith there. He obeyed the Bab at once, and alone, clad in the simplest attire, staff in hand, he went down the mountainside and walked all the way back to his home in India, teaching in every village along the way. Calmly, the Bab waited for the inevitable edict of Haji Mirza Agassi. It was not long in coming. When the news of all these startling events reached the capital, the Prime Minister was violently angry. He had failed again. He knew he must not fail a 3rd time. He demanded that the Bab be transferred at once from the prison at Shirik to the city of Tabriz. Strict orders were given to avoid any contact with those towns to which the Bab's influence had already spread. He was to be brought to Tabriz by an indirect and unsuspected route that would take him through the village of Umiraya, now Rizaya. No matter, however, where the Bab was sent, he was always received in virtually the same way. On his arrival in Umiraya, the Prince Malik Kazim Mirza ceremoniously received him and gave the Bab a guard of footmen to hold back the gathering crowd. The people were crushing against each other in their eagerness to catch a glimpse of so marvellous a prisoner. Arrangements were made one day for the Bab to go to the public bath. The prince, having heard wondrous tales about his guest, was anxious to test the Bab's power and courage. He ordered his groom to offer the Bab one of his wildest horses to ride. The groom feared that the Bab might suffer harm from this untamed animal. He secretly approached the Bab and tried to convince him not to mount this steed, which had already thrown off the best of horsemen. "Fear not," the Bab replied. "Do as you have been bidden, and commit us to the care of the Almighty." The villagers had learned of the prince's plan. They filled the public square the next morning, eager to witness the test and see what would happen to the Bab. The unruly horse was brought from the stable. The frightened groom cautiously gave the bridle to the Bab. The Bab quietly stepped towards the animal. Gently he caressed the steed, and then slowly placed his foot in the stirrup. The horse stood motionless as the Bab mounted. He rode the animal to the public bath. All along the way people tried to rush in from every side to marvel at such a miracle and offer their allegiance to him. On his return from the bath, he again mounted the same horse and was once again acclaimed by the townspeople. As soon as the Bab left the public bath, the people of Umiraya rushed to take away every drop of water that had been used. When the Bab was told that many people had spontaneously arisen to accept his faith, because of these remarkable events which they considered a miracle, he calmly quoted the Quran, saying, "Think men that when they say, 'We believe,' they shall be let alone and not be put to proof?" The comment was fully justified by the attitude of these same people when they later heard the news of the dreadful treatment of the Bab in Tabriz. Hardly a handful of those who so eagerly proclaimed their belief in his cause on that day would remain faithful. Miracles, the followers of his faith were to learn, are but a secondary proof, and are of value only to those who witness them. Of themselves, miracles have no lasting value. It was now as it had been in the time of Christ, for when Jesus miraculously healed the 10 lepers, only one remained to thank him. He said, "Were there not 10 cleansed? But where are the 9? Tales of what had happened raced ahead of the Bab and his escort, causing a great wave of enthusiasm across all Persia. Tabriz, in particular, was in the throes of the wildest excitement. Word of the Bab's coming ignited people's imaginations and aroused fierce animosity in the religious leaders. Such was the public fervour that the authorities decided to confine the Bab in a place outside the gates of the city. Precautions were taken, warnings were published, restrictions were enforced, yet all of these only served to aggravate a situation that had already become critical. The Bab had captured the people's fancy, and nothing the officials or clergy could do was able to diminish their ardour. The Prime Minister, Haji Mirza Akasi, issued an order from the capital. He demanded that all the leading religious dignitaries and government officials hold an immediate gathering. His words made clear the grave nature of this crisis. The religious leaders, he said, must decide at once upon the most effective measures for extinguishing the fire that the Bab had kindled. They must bring the Bab's power over the public to an abrupt end. There must be no mistakes. The Bab must be summoned before this important gathering, and there he must be humiliated in a manner that would permanently undermine his influence. The Bab was well aware of the Prime Minister's intentions. On the second night after his arrival in Tabriz, the Bab told his friends that the next day, in the presence of the heir to the Persian throne, the assembled religious leaders, and the notables of Tabriz, he would publicly acclaim his mission. The meeting was arranged according to the Prime Minister's plan. It took place in the governor's office. An officer of the army was sent to bring the Bab into the presence of the gathering. Already a multitude thronged the outside entrance. They pressed forward in such large numbers that a passage had to be forced through the crowd before the Bab could enter. When he came into the hall, he saw that every seat was occupied except one, which had been reserved as a seat of honour for the heir to the throne, the king's son. The Bab courteously greeted the assembly. He knew they planned to humiliate him by making him stand. Without the slightest hesitation, he walked to the seat of honour and sat down. A silence, long and intense, fell over the gathering. At last the stillness was broken by the presiding officer of the gathering. "Whom do you claim to be?" he asked the Bab, "and what is the message which you have brought?" It was the story of Christ retold. When Jesus was taken before the high priests and elders for their pre-planned investigation, he was asked, "Art thou the Christ?" He replied, "I am." There could no longer remain any doubt of his mission. In like manner, with similar words, the Bab replied to this assembly, which also wished to hear him condemn himself, by making the same staggering claim. 3 times he repeated it in their presence. "I am," exclaimed the Bab. I am, the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, at whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, and the hour of whose revelation you have prayed God to hasten. Verily I say, it is incumbent upon the peoples of both the East and the West to obey my word and to pledge allegiance to my person." A hush fell over the hall. A witness to that stirring event has written, "Immediately after he had declared himself to be the promised one, a feeling of awe seized those who were present. They had dropped their heads in silent confusion. The pallor of their faces betrayed the agitation of their hearts." It was recorded of that meeting, "The majesty of his gait, the expression of overpowering confidence which sat upon his brow, above all, the spirit of power which shone from his whole being, appeared to have for a moment crushed the soul out of the body of those whom he had greeted." At last, unable to bear the tension any longer, a member of the assembly arose and arrogantly reprimanded the Bab, calling him a wretched and immature lad of Shiraz. The Bab turned to the presiding officer. "Your Honour," he said, "I have not come hither of my own accord. I have been summoned to this place." "Hold your peace, you perverse and contemptible follower of Satan," the presiding officer retorted. The Bab serenely responded, "Your Honour, I maintain what I have already declared." The authorities asked no truly sincere questions about the Bab's mission or his teaching. Instead, they indulged in a series of insulting and flippant questions that had nothing to do with his faith, but were designed solely to humiliate their prisoner. After patiently bearing their abuse and insults throughout the session, the Bab quoted their own holy book to them, saying, "Far be the glory of thy Lord, the Lord of all greatness, from what they impute to him, and peace be upon his apostles, and praise be to God, the Lord of all the worlds." Immediately afterwards he rose, and summarily ended the gathering by leaving the hall abruptly. The religious authorities at once began to spread the most unfavourable and false reports of the Bab's part in that trial. They said his answers to their inquiries were both childish and unsatisfying, that they were not even the replies of a sane man, let alone those of a promised Redeemer. Fortunately for history, 2 European scholars, following much investigation, preserved an unbiased account of those proceedings. The first was Dr. T.K. Cheney, a Christian clergyman and student of that period. He has written, "As for the Muslim accounts of that trial, those which we have before us do not bear the stamp of truth. They seem to be forgeries. Knowing what we do of the Bab, it is probable that he had the best of the argument, and that the doctors and functionaries who attended the meeting were unwilling to put on record their own fiasco." The second scholar was Professor Edward G. Brown of Cambridge University. He characterized the questions that the religious leaders had asked the Bab as frivolous and even indecent. He writes of the trial that the whole examination was a farce throughout, that the sentence was a foregone conclusion, that no serious attempts to apprehend the nature and evidence of the Bab's claim and doctrine was made, and that from the first to the last a systematic course of browbeating, irony, and mockery was pursued, appear to me to be the facts proved no less by the Mohammedan than by the Baha'i accounts of these inquisitorial proceedings. Even the presiding officer at that gathering, Haji Mullah Muhammad, was displeased with the way the priests had conducted the meeting. He did not wish to have his name associated with it. "How shameful is the discourtesy of the people of Tabriz," he said. "What could possibly be the connection between these idle remarks and the consideration of such weighty and momentous issues?" A.L.M. Nicholas, referring to an earlier inquisition of the Bab by similarly hostile religious leaders, says they conditioned their belief in his truth on his ability to explain 3 miracles to them. First, they asked how a human being could be immediately transported from one part of the world to another, very distant point, Next, they asked how one person could be in 60 different places at one instant. Then they asked how the heavens could revolve rapidly during the reign of a tyrant and slowly during the reign of an imam. It was the solution of these insanities, said Nicholas, that they proposed to the Bab. I shall not dwell on them any longer. One will easily understand the emptiness and arrogance of all these minds. The Bab was brought home to the home of Mirza Ali Ashkar, the ranking clergyman and head of the religious court of Tabriz. There he was given over to the governor's bodyguard for a humiliating punishment. However, the guard refused, preferring not to become involved in a matter that he viewed as solely the concern of the clergy. Mirza Ali Ashkar himself was thus forced to inflict the punishment on the Bab with his own hands. Just as Jesus had fallen under the scourge of Pontius Pilate following his examination in the judgment hall, where he proclaimed himself as the Redeemer of men, the Bab, too, was subjected to the same indignity following a similar trial and the same great proclamation. 11 times the rod of the bastinado was applied to his feet. At one point he was struck across the face with one of the blows, which caused a great wound. Afterwards, Dr. Cormick, an English physician who was residing in Tabriz, was called to treat the Bab for a few days, and, along with 2 Persian doctors, to determine whether he was sane. This was to help the authorities decide whether or not to put him to death. Dr. Cormick set down in writing his impressions of the Bab gained from those meetings. The Bab was aware of my having been sent with 2 other Persian doctors to see whether he was of sane mind or merely a madman. With this knowledge, he was loath to answer any questions I put to him. To all inquiries, he merely regarded us with a mild look, chanting in a low, melodious voice some hymns, I suppose. He only once deigned to answer me on my saying that I was willing to know something about his religion, as I might perhaps be inclined to adopt it. He regarded me very intently on my saying this, and replied that he had no doubt of all Europeans coming over to his religion. Our report to the Shah at the time was of a nature to spare his life. He was a very mild and delicate-looking man, with a melodious, soft voice which struck me much. In fact, his whole look and deportment went far to dispose one in his favour. The Bab was not released after his scourging. He was marched back under heavy guard to the prison of Chirik. However, he left behind him in Tabriz the memory of a great victory. News of his momentous declaration spread rapidly throughout the country. Many who had been opposers became followers. Many, pointing a finger at the cruel behavior of the religious leaders, recalled a well-known Islamic prophecy about the Promised One that said most of his enemies would be the Islamic religious authorities. Those who felt great anguish because of the cruelties inflicted on the gentle Bab, these words of his brought comfort. Be patient, for God verily hath vowed to establish thy glory in every land, among all who dwell on earth. The trial in Tabriz had enabled the Bab to set forth clearly and emphatically the fundamental features of his faith in the presence of the most illustrious Persian dignitaries. It had also enabled him to destroy in brief and convincing language the arguments of his enemies. Just as Jesus had said, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me," the Bab, too, made it plain that his message was an outpouring from one far greater than himself. His purpose was to proclaim the word of God as a messenger of God. The people were free to believe it or not as they chose. When the Bab returned to the prison fortress at Chirik, he wrote a bold and moving letter denouncing the treacherous Prime Minister Haji Mirza Agassi. It foretold his downfall, which was soon to come. This was written as a warning to all such leaders who, refusing the truth themselves, had shut the door in the face of those whose destiny they held in their power. The Bab gave the letter to one of his disciples and told him to deliver it into the hands of Haji Mirza Agassi personally. The letter was titled The Sermon of Wrath. It began with the words, O thou who hast disbelieved in God and turned away thy face from his signs. From that hour forth, the dreadful consequences that had already befallen so many who had persecuted the Bab and his followers began to descend upon the ringleaders of his affliction at Tabriz. The head of the religious court, Mirza Ali Ashkar, who with his own hands had scourged the Bab in the prayer house, was despised and feared by a people who had sickened of his leadership and who prayed to be delivered from his evil ways. In less than a year, Mirza Ali Ashkar was struck with paralysis. After enduring excruciating pain, he died a miserable death in abject circumstances. Following his death, the functions of his office were permanently abolished in Tabriz. The very name of the institution that had been associated with his name became abhorred by the people. The king himself, Muhammad Shah, did not escape retribution. He had been weak enough to listen to the malevolent promptings of his prime minister, Haji Mirza Agassi, and had refused to meet the Bab in spite of his personal letter requesting such an audience. The king, instead, had banished the Bab to a remote mountain prison. No sooner had he agreed to issue that order than he was afflicted with an abrupt reversal of fortune. Several parts of his kingdom broke out in revolt. His health declined rapidly. Finally, at the early age of 40, he fell a victim to a complication of maladies that the Bab had foretold would in the end devour him. The Prime Minister, Haji Mirza Agassi, who had been the chief conspirator in the outrages committed against the Bab, was made the major target of this avenging wrath. Scarcely a year and 6 months from the moment he first became between the Bab and the king and prevented their meeting, he was hurled from power. While the Bab was still in prison, to which Haji Mirza Agassi had condemned him, and from which he had sent the Sermon of Wrath, the Prime Minister was dismissed in disgrace from his post, stripped of all his dishonestly acquired property and riches. C.R. Markham's A General Sketch of the History of Persia says, Haji Mirza Agassi, the half-crazy old Prime Minister, was sedulously collecting wealth for himself at Tehran at the expense of the wretched country. The governorships of provinces were sold to the highest bidders, who oppressed the people in a fearful manner. When knowledge of the enormity of his graft and thefts became known, he had to flee for shelter from the anger of his countrymen. Haji Mirza Agassi had expelled the Bab from his home and banished him to a far place. Now he, in turn, was expelled from his native country and banished to Iraq, where he fell a victim to disease, and gnawing grief shortened his life. History has recorded these words of the last days of Haji Mirza Agassi. He met his death in circumstances of abject poverty and unspeakable distress.